Good morning. Welcome to Southwest Park's Bible Study Time. We are beginning a new series of study in Proverbs and Song of Solomon. So for the next 3 months, we'll be looking at those two books in the Old Testament. This week we start in Proverbs, and we're going to look at the first chapter. Our lesson is entitled Charted Waters. God's Word warns us of the consequences of foolish choices. Our English word proverb is made up of two Latin words. The first is pro, which means instead of, and verba, which means words. So a proverb is a sentence that's used instead of many words. It's a short statement that summarizes a wise principle. The Hebrew word translated proverb means a comparison. And as we'll see as we look at the Proverbs, many of the Proverbs are comparisons and contrasts. So the Jews did a lot of teaching through Proverbs. These short, catchy sentences were easy to remember, and they condensed a lot of wisdom in a small space. And we continue that practice today. There are many proverbs that we use. A stitch in time saves nine. Things like that we're very familiar with. The book of Proverbs was written by Solomon. We're told that in the first chapter, the first verse, and other places in Proverbs. He was well qualified to write the wisdom literature, which Proverbs is a part of. Listen to what 1 Kings 4:29 and following says about Solomon. God gave wisdom to Solomon, and very great discernment, as well as breadth of understanding, as the sand which is on the edge of the seashore. The wisdom of Solomon was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, more than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all the men, Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the children of Mahal, and he was very well known. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke concerning the trees, from the cedar which is in Lebanon up to the hyssop which grows on the wall. He also spoke concerning the animals, concerning the birds, concerning the creeping things, and concerning the fish. They came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So, Solomon wrote the Proverbs. There are 31 chapters in Proverbs. The first 24, it says that Solomon wrote. Then in chapter 25, verse 1, it says, "These are also Proverbs of Solomon, which officials of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied." So many years after Solomon lived, during King Hezekiah's reign, his scribes wrote down the Proverbs 25 through 29. Proverbs 30 and 31 are attributed to other writers. Agur, Psalm 30, and King Lemuel, chapter 31, although some scholars feel like that King Lemuel is Solomon as well. Solomon was, as we've seen from what's said in 1 Kings, was certainly known for his wisdom, even though we know that later in life he turned to idolatry and folly. So we see both sides of this equation in Solomon's life. The book of Proverbs is listed among the poetical books of the Old Testament, along with Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And like these books, Proverbs is written in a poetic style. But Hebrew poetry is different from English poetry. English poems usually have a rhyme and a meter, but Hebrew poetry doesn't. Instead of rhyming successive lines of a poem, Hebrew poetry matches the thought in successive lines. So this feature of Hebrew poetry is called parallelism. And there are several different types of parallelism used in Proverbs. We see synonymous parallelism. That's a feature where the second line repeats the thought of the first line, but with slightly different words. And so the repetition kind of intensifies the thoughts and the feelings being expressed. Proverbs 19:5 is an example. A false witness will not go unpublished, and he who speaks lies will not escape. The same thought expressed two different ways. The second type is antithetical parallelism, and in this feature, the second line is the opposite of the first. And that's the most common type that we will see here in the book of Proverbs. Again, Proverbs 19:16. He who keeps the commandment keeps his soul, but he who is careless of his ways will die. Second statement is the opposite, or the antithesis of the first statement. The third type is synthetic parallelism, or it's sometimes called climactic parallelism. And in this style, the second line completes the thought of the first line. Proverbs 22:2 says, the rich and the poor have a common bond. The Lord is the maker of them all. So the second line completes the first line. Many of the Proverbs are also based on comparisons between parallel lines. These are the better than Proverbs that we're familiar with. Better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. Proverbs 16:8. All of these examples illustrate the heart of Hebrew poetry, parallelism. Each verse sharpens and heightens the thought by use of restatement, comparison, building to a climax. So these devices, these subtle devices, they draw us in, they cause us to see and understand the point of the proverb more clearly. I really debated about whether to include that description of Hebrew parallelism, but I decided that the benefits outweighed the risk. But I know that possibly many of you out there have been so stirred by this scintillating explanation of Hebrew parallelism that you may have trouble controlling yourself, settling down, and concentrating on the rest of the lesson. So, everybody, just take a deep breath, focus, gain control, and we'll move on. The key word in Proverbs is wisdom. We commonly think of wisdom as the ability to use knowledge in the right way. And that's a good practical definition. But in the Bible, wisdom means so much more than that. True wisdom is a matter of the heart and not just the mind. It's a spiritual matter. There is a wisdom of this world, and there's a divine wisdom from above. James talks about that in the 3rd chapter of James, starting in verse 13. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by his good behavior, his works, with the humility of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and tell lies against the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there is disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceful, gentle, obedient, full of mercy and good fruits, non-judgmental, without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace among those who make peace. The basic idea behind wisdom is skill. I never really had thought about that, but the term wisdom is used in the Old Testament to describe the abilities of garment makers, craftsmen, goldsmiths, even professional mourners at funerals. The book of Proverbs, as we'll see, uses the term wisdom to speak of the skill in living in a way that honors and pleases God. What distinguishes the biblical wisdom from the wisdom of the other ancient nations is its foundation in the fear of God. And we do have wisdom literature from ancient Egypt and from Mesopotamia, the old Sumerian documents there. But they're distinct from biblical wisdom because the foundation of the biblical wisdom, as we'll see in our lesson today, is the fear of the Lord. Since God's the source of wisdom, reverence for God is the controlling principle for applying these observations about the way life works. Proverbs mentions 3 different types of people who desperately need wisdom. And we'll see this repeatedly throughout the book of Proverbs. They're described as the fool, the simple, and the scorner. The fool is the person who's dense, sluggish, careless, and self-satisfied. Nabal in 1 Samuel 25 is a good example of this. And the name Nabal actually means fool. The fool hates instruction. He's self-confident. He talks without thinking and mocks at sin. The simple are those who believe everything and everybody, and they lack discernment. They're easily led astray by others because they lack understanding. They can't see ahead, and so as a result, they repeatedly walk into trouble. Scorners, or scoffers, as it's translated in some of your translations, mock at God's wisdom because it's too high for them, but they will not admit it because they know everything. The Hebrew word for scorner literally means to make a mouth. And we can easily picture them sneering and curling up their lips in scorn. They never profit from rebuke. Proverbs, by contrast, outlines for us the character of the wise. They listen to instruction. They obey what they hear. They store up what they learn. And they win others to the Lord. Flee from sin. Watch their tongue. Are diligent in their daily work. Proverbs is valuable to us as a guidebook for practical wisdom in everyday life. It teaches us about such things as the tongue, money matters, friendship, the home, business contracts. Like I say, there are 31 chapters, so it sets up very nicely to take one chapter a day, and you can read through Proverbs every month there, just in that way. Many books in the New Testament quote from the Proverbs, at least a half dozen different New Testament books. Proverbs are generalizations about life, and they're not promises for us to claim, although there are great promises found in the book of Proverbs. So the basic requirement for understanding and applying these Proverbs is the fear of the Lord. We're going to see that in today's lesson. And a willingness to obey. And we're going to see that in next week's lesson. The aim of the book is to give the godly person skill in human relationships and endeavors. This begins with submission to the Lord. Okay, so let's get started in the first chapter here of Proverbs. Our focal passage starts with verse 7. The first 6 verses there are kind of introduction. The first says the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. But the second verse is important because it gives us the purposes of the book of Proverbs: to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding. So the book of Proverbs has 2 purposes. First purpose is that the disciple will develop skillfulness and discipline in holy living. As we've said before, wisdom basically means skill. In Proverbs, wisdom means skillful living, the ability to make wise choices and to live successfully according to the moral standards of the covenant world standards given by God. The one who lives skillfully in this way produces things of lasting value to God and to the community around him. Second major purpose of the book of Proverbs is for the disciple to acquire discernment. To understand or discern means to distinguish between things, to be able to compare concepts and form evaluations and make analogies. Proverbs will train us to discern lessons about life, such as distinguishing permanent values from immediate gratifications. Children want immediate gratification. We see that readily in their makeup. And they have no thought of anything beyond getting that immediate gratification. One of the marks of maturity is the ability to look beyond what gives you immediate satisfaction towards something that will give you a more permanent satisfaction. Sadly, many people never make much progress in this area. They live their whole lives living for the here and now, with little thought of providing for tomorrow. Sadly, that's also true of us as Christians. So we must develop the discernment to look beyond the things of today toward the things that have lasting and permanent value. And that's one of the things that Proverbs will help us to do as we study through this book. The starting point, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So what does Solomon mean by the fear of the Lord? Fearing God is an important concept in the Old Testament. Fear can mean terror or dread, but in the Old Testament, it most often indicates awe or reverence. Over the years, I've trying to teach Bible lessons, I've tried to define, articulate the fear of the Lord a lot of times, and I've never once come away feeling like I got everything there. And perhaps that's as it should be, because there's so much wrapped up in the fear of the Lord. One of the things that I was studying this week that I saw in this is that the fear of the Lord, the way we relate to Him, expresses the fear of the Lord. To fear God is to express loyalty to Him and faithfulness to His covenant. For example, after the people of Israel conquered the land of Canaan, Joshua charged them to faithfully fear God by serving Him alone and putting away other gods. In 2 Kings 17, 35 through 39, the fear of God describes loyalty to Him in contrast to worshiping other gods. So loyalty and faithfulness, steadfastness to God is one of the characteristics of fearing the Lord. Those who fear God exhibit trust in Him and obedience to His commandments. We see this in the Psalm, Psalm 44. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust and does not turn to the proud or to those who fall away to a lie. Psalm 115:11. You who fear the Lord, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. The designation of those who fear the Lord is used to refer to the community of believers, the community of those faithful to Him. Psalm 66:16. Come and hear, all you God-fearers, and I will tell you what He has done for me. According to the Old Testament, those who fear God obtain His protection, His wisdom, and His blessing. The fear of God is often stated in response to God's holiness. For example, in Psalms 111, verse 9, the biblical writers describe God and His name as holy and awesome. The term awesome there, the Hebrew word that's translated awesome, is a form of the word that means to fear. The fear of God is also related to God's greatness. People fear God because of his mighty deeds. For example, the Israelites respond to God's saving power in bringing them out of Egypt by fearing him. In Exodus 14:30, and the Lord saved Israel on that day from the hand of Egypt. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. And Israel saw the great hand that the Lord displayed against Egypt. And the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in Moses his servant. So, the biblical texts often parallel the fear of God with obedience. In Genesis 22:12, God recognizes Abraham's obedience to sacrifice Isaac, his fear of him. And that link continues through Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 6. So you must keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his way and fearing him. In the wisdom literature, the fear of the Lord is described as the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. Here in verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. In chapter 9, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. Psalm 111:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do his commandments. His praise endures forever. Proverbs classifies those without a fear of God as haters of knowledge. Down in the 29th verse of the first chapter, for they that hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. So, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's the starting point. That's where we start from. Without a proper understanding of who God is, and a proper reverence and awe and respect for who God is, everything else is pretty much useless and meaningless. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. On the other hand, fools disdain wisdom and knowledge and discipline. So this term fools describe those who lack understanding, those who won't store up knowledge, who fail to attain wisdom, talk loosely, are filled with pride, and are contentious. They are morally unskilled and refuse any correction. Fools are people who despise wisdom and discipline. They treat those virtues as worthless and contemptible. Fools arrogantly reject teaching because they believe themselves to be right. In chapter 12, verse 15 in Proverbs, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. So, the beginning of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools here don't want any part of that. Okay, verses 8 and 9 tell us how to start on the path of obedience. My son, hear the instruction of thy father. Forsake not the law of thy mother. For they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about your neck. These opening chapters of Proverbs here are lectures of a father to a son. And the father is admonishing the son to choose the path of wisdom over the path of folly. Later on, we'll also see wisdom and folly being personified as two young women and making their appeal to the young child. In the first 7 chapters, they're largely addressed to my son, and that expression occurs about 15 times in these chapters. And my son is a generic word for child, so you can think my child and be accurate there. So in these chapters, we hear the heartbeat of a parent who wants the best in life for his child. And in verse 8 here, my son, hear the instruction of your father and don't forsake the law of your mother, of what your mother says. Note that both the father and the mother are involved in teaching, and they both provide warnings not to abandon what they've taught. They are obeying the instruction of Moses in Deuteronomy 6, 6 and 7. These words that I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall recite them to your children, and you shall talk about them at the time of your living in your house, and at the time of your going on the road, and at the time of your lying down, and at the time of your rising up. So they have faithfully taught their children. Henry Bosch reminds us how much we owe to the influence of godly parents, especially godly mothers. Many great men of the past have been richly blessed by what they learned at their mother's knee. Consider Moses, his mother Jochebed; Samuel, his mother Hannah; Timothy, mother Lois, and grandmother Eunice. The maternal care and godly influence experienced by these spiritual leaders bore much fruit in their lives. Think too of Augustine, John Newton, and the zealous Wesley brothers. Their names would probably never have lighted the page of history if it hadn't been for the godly women who raised them in homes where the law of love and Christian witness was their daily guide and inspiration. The mention of the Wesley brothers, Susanna Wesley, their mother, is a remarkable story. She was the youngest of 25 children. Yes, you heard that right, 25. She was the youngest child. Her father was a preacher. She was very intelligent, but she never had much chance for education. She was a strong-willed woman, but in the late 1600s and early 1700s, when she lived, it was a man's world. But she married an older man, also a preacher, and they had 19 children. And she raised those 19 children, taught them in very dire circumstances. Her husband was a pastor there at Epworth, didn't make much money, wasn't very good manager of what he made. He wound up in debtor's prison, I believe, twice there. So she got along without much of this world's goods. One description I read said her house burned down twice, her barn fell down, her health failed, and yet through all of that, she nurtured and taught and raised two of the world's greatest evangelists, Charles and John Wesley. So that's an encouragement to us there. So he challenges, my son, listen to the instruction of your father and don't forsake the teachings of your mother. And then he describes, they shall be an ornament of grace under your head and chains about your neck. The word rendered wreath or garland or ornament literally referred to a headdress that signified respect and authority of the community. Likewise, the pendant or chain that was referenced was worn to signify one's honored social status. When you think about it, those who give honor and respect to their parents and their teachings are overwhelmingly admired all around the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, people are what their mothers make them. Abraham Lincoln said, all that I am or hope to be I owe to my angel mother. One of the most beautiful letters ever written was penned by the Scottish essayist and historian to his mother, Margaret Carlyle. He wrote, "My dear good mother, let it ever be a comfort to you, however weak you are, that you did your part honorably and well while in strength, and were a noble mother to me and to us all. I am now myself grown old, and have had various things to do and suffer for so many years, but there's nothing I've ever had to be so much thankful for as the mother I had. That's a truth which I know well, and perhaps this day it may again be some comfort to you. Yes, surely, for if there has been good in the things I have uttered in the world's hearing, it was your voice that was essentially speaking through me, essentially what you and my brave father meant and taught me to me. This was the purport of all I spoke and wrote. And if in the few years that may remain to me I am to get any more written for the world, the essence of it, as far as it's worthy and good, will still be yours. May God reward you, my dearest mother, for all you have done for me. I never can." That was written by Thomas Carlyle and found after his death, entitled "My Last Letter to Mother." Verses 10 through 14 describe how we can resist sin. "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with us, let us lie in wait to shed blood. Let us lurk secretly for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all kinds of precious possessions. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in your lot among us. Let us all have one purse." Often when a young person ruins their life, the explanation is given, they got in with the wrong crowd. And we see that process described here in these verses. First, though, we see a warning. Life is full of enticement to evil. And so we have to have the courage, the backbone to say no over and over again. The norm in life is for a young person to leave the more protected environment of the home, go out into the world to make a life of their own. Godly parents seek to educate, train, prepare their children for that time. But they also know that even the most obedient of children will face severe temptation in that new environment. Some of the most intense temptations will come through their peers. And so, that's why the wise father says, don't give in when sinners entice you. Verse 10 here. The word for sinners here is a form of the word meaning to fall short of the target. And so in the context of this verse, it means falling short of God's standard for holy living. So those sinners that will entice this young man are those who have no intention of adhering to the principles of godly living. And that, thus, it's completely opposite of what he has learned from his parents that we saw described in the previous two verses. Many people, when they leave home and go into the world, fall victim to the intense peer pressure around them. From the context of the verses here that follow, it seems like Solomon has in mind some kind of gang that preyed on vulnerable people. Gang life, whether an organized lot or an informal band of peers, can exert tremendous pressure on those who are seeking camaraderie or easy money or even a sense of belonging. We read this, I was reminded back in 1907, my grandfather was 17 years old and he went west from Kentucky. I had relatives down in the Midwest, and he spent about 5 years out there. I don't know a whole lot about what went on in those 5 years. I wish I'd had the presence of mind to ask him, but I didn't. But in 1968, when I was 17 years old, I made my plans to go west as well, to Weatherford College to go to school. And when I told my grandfather what I was going to do, he gave me some advice, a couple of pieces of advice. First thing he said was, I never made it to Texas, but I did winter one winter down on the Oklahoma border with a bunch of Texans. He said that group of people could tell more tall tales than any group I ever was around. But then he gave me some very serious advice, and it's some of the best advice that I've ever received. He said, wherever you go, there are good people, but it's up to you to find them. And I think that's the essence here of what he says in these verses. Beware of those that you associate with. It is important who you hang out with there. There are good people everywhere you go, but we must seek them out. Satan's wiles, verse 11, are often subtle, and he plays on our desires, tempting us to think selfishly. But then he slowly reels us in to sinful action. But there are times when Satan's more direct and he brazenly challenges. And that's what's described here. Come with us. Let's lay in wait. Let's ambush someone and kill them. It's hard to understand what would make a young person vulnerable to some kind of an appeal like this. Maybe he's flattered that these tough people would accept him as one of the gang. Come with us, they say. Maybe he's lured by the excitement of something so daring. We live in a world that's hard to understand. We live in a world that's increasingly callous and brutal. And there are many people whose sensitivity to evil has been dulled. So, come with us. Let's lay in wait. Let's ambush this person and kill them, even though they haven't done anything. It says, let's swallow them up alive as the grave. That's a poetic way of talking about death here. And so, again, perhaps this young man is bored by his sheltered life and he wants to do something for kicks. So here it is. Here, sudden and violent death, and then a quick disposal of the evidence. The appeal continues. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. So the great incentive there, of course, is that they'll all be rich overnight. There will be enough loot to fill the houses of all the accomplishments. Cast in thy lot among us. Let us all have one purse. So, the word, the appeal, come on. You'll make a bundle. Everyone shares equally. You can't lose. Well, let's look at the next few verses here, and we'll see the result of that sin. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path. For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. But they lie in wait for their own blood. They lurk secretly for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its owner. The concerned father here again urges the child to reject the road of sin. And the best way to reject that road is never to start down it. One step on this precipitous path is a step toward destruction. So walk not in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path. Stay away from going down that road. For their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. So Solomon warns here. This group, they've chosen a particular direction in life. They're eager to participate in evil, shed blood. This is obviously directly contrary to the commandments of God. It's directly contrary to the teaching we saw referenced in verse 8 and 9. In verse 17, he uses a picture here. He says, surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. Back in that time, people in that part of the world used nets to trap birds, to capture birds. And frequently they would put them on the paths where birds were going to come, but they would camouflage them so the birds wouldn't recognize them. So a bird has enough sense to avoid a net that's plain and obvious there. It can be clearly seen. So it'd be futile to spread out a net for birds that are watching or they're left in plain sight. But as Solomon describes these people here, this criminal gang, they're so blinded by evil that they fail to recognize the obvious trap. The blind folly of greed leads them to their doom. He says they lay in wait for their own blood. They lurk privily for their own lives. They make a trap for their own lives, and then they walk right into it. So are the ways of everyone that's greedy of gain, which taketh away the life of the owners thereof. So these words conclude this story. They introduce a theme here that wisdom is a matter of life and death. There is a moral to this story. Those who try to get rich quick pay for their greed with their lives. So are the ways of everyone who's greedy for gain. It destroys our lives. We're just about out of time. The rest of chapter 1, there's some good stuff in there, because there we begin, starting in verse 20, we see Lady Wisdom personified, making her appeal. Wisdom calls out in the streets. In the squares, she raises her voice. On a busy corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city, she speaks her sayings. How long, O simple ones, will you love simplicity? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? There we see those three descriptions of people who need wisdom that we've talked about in the introduction there. She goes on down, Solomon goes on down to say in verse 32, the waywardness of the simple ones will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. What makes people's stubborn refusal so irrational is that God's commandments, God's warnings, are for our good, not God's. God's given us commandments and principles. They're for our good. God never gives us a commandment because he's arbitrary or because he doesn't want us to have fun. God says, thou shalt have no other gods before me, not because of his jealousy of his own position, but because he knows that if we put anything before him, it will hurt us. If we understand the principle behind these facts, we can also understand why God chastens us. Whom the Lord loves, he chastens us. Hebrews 12:6 says. Every man is free to make his own choices in life, but he is not free to choose the consequences of his choice. God has established certain moral principles in the world, and those principles dictate the consequence for every choice. Now he ends on positive note. Whoever listens to me will dwell in security and rest securely from dread and disaster. So in contrast to the judgment promised to unbelievers, wisdom promises security and peace to those who will listen and believe. Next week, we will look at chapters 2 and 3, the focal passages in chapter 3. But in the coming week, take a close look at chapter 2. There's some really good stuff in chapter 2. So see you next week.